It is 12 o'clock Pacific time. My name is Mike Hogan. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Development here at Medical Teams. We're going to get started here in just 1 minute. I'm going to let you all know that we're recording this, so just so that we could share it with others that aren't able to attend. And before we get started, if you want to write your name and where you're from in the chat, that would be great. Can everyone chat? Because I think I'm the only one I've seen put a chat in there. There we go. We got Sara Phillips wrote from Dallas, Texas. Oh, Dane, the chat is disabled. So if you would want to go ahead and undisable that, that would be great. Thank you. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Mike Hogan, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Development here at Medical Teams International. And I'm excited that you are all here for this update 1 year after Medical Teams began a response in Ukraine. You can see behind me, this is our distribution center. And we shipped pallets to partners in Ukraine almost within days of the war breaking out. It's one of the many ways we've engaged. But today you're going to hear more about how we responded. I'm getting some quick direction from those that are helping us. We're not using the chat function today. We will be using the Q&A function. So if you have questions along the way, please go ahead and use the Q&A function. We're in the Zoom webinar format, so it's a little different than a typical Zoom, and that's why I wrongly directed you to put your questions in the chat, but instead use the Q&A feature in the bottom of your screen at any time. We're going to have speakers address your questions and provide answers near the end of our time together. And I mentioned this a few minutes ago, but we are recording this session so that we could share it with some others. Before we jump in, we are going to take a moment to acknowledge the ongoing crisis after the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. This has been huge. Tens of thousands of people have died. Medical Teams has been supporting our partners on the ground there, and we appreciate your ongoing prayers and support for the recovery and rebuilding efforts. 1 year ago, Medical Teams began our response to the humanitarian crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has so far caused the largest ground war and the largest refugee crisis in Europe since the end of World War II. This response was only possible because of your support. We were able to rally so quickly because we had so many supporters that gave generously, gave abundantly, and there were so many of you that got involved. Today, we want to make sure you hear how your generosity was used to save lives and give you the opportunity to ask questions about the response. But before we do that, we're going to take some time to watch a quick video to remind ourselves of what our neighbors in Ukraine have been facing over the last year. I do want to warn you, this video does contain some disturbing images, so viewer discretion is advised, but sit back for 1 moment and let's watch this video together.
February the 24th, 2022, the day everything changed for Ukraine. Through the chaos, one thing was clear. Months of military build-up had been no bluff. This was a Russian invasion. From Belarus, southern Russia, and Crimea, troops, tanks, and aircraft poured across borders. Fleeing the Russian blitzkrieg, civilians crowded train stations and highways. Hundreds of thousands of women and children headed abroad. Men had to stay.
My heart's being torn apart. I'm sorry. It's tough. When families are separated, it's very hard.
Ukraine was fighting for its survival as a sovereign nation. Volunteers joined the army and territorial defense groups. One of those who picked up a gun was Ihor. He helped defend Irpin, a Kiev suburb that saw fierce fighting. Ihor described to me what it had been like.
I had no fear, I don't know why. We were all determined not to give up our land. We understood our weapons were weak against their armor, but we had motivation.
Because of fierce Ukrainian resistance, Russia's invasion wasn't going well. At the end of March, after huge losses of men and machinery, Russia abandoned its attempt to seize Kiev. What they left behind shocked the world. Bucha, the most infamous, but civilian bodies were found in nearly every settlement the Russians had occupied, often showing signs of torture and execution. The seasons have carried Anastasia and her grief through spring, summer, autumn, and now to winter. When the Russians abducted her son, they didn't take him far, just 200 meters down the road to the pig farm where his body was found.
Through the window, I saw him being taken out. There was a car outside. They've taken from one of the villagers. They put him in and left. I didn't know where. They were taken at 5:30 and shot immediately that evening. Ihor lay as if he was sleeping.
In the east, the battle for Donbass became an attritional grind. But to the south, Russia had more to show for its efforts. Mariupol, on the Azov Sea coast, finally fell to the Russians in May. A city of 400,000 people before the war lay in ruins. But Ukraine was preparing to strike back. It retook the Kharkiv region in a surprise September counter-offensive. That was followed by a strike on Russia's bridge to Crimea and a forced Russian retreat from the city of Kherson. This was Moscow's response. Running short of military options, Russia launched drones and cruise missiles at Ukraine's energy grid, an attempt to freeze the country into submission as winter approached. Widespread blackouts and sub-zero temperatures are a challenge for everyone, particularly those without much money. Lyudmila lives in a smoke-blackened, bomb-damaged apartment block in Irpin. Yet she still counts herself lucky.
To be honest, my heart bleeds seeing these ruins, but we are alive. We covered the windows with film. We had hope because we have something left. Others lost everything.
As 2022 ends, Ukrainians leave behind them a year of indescribable suffering. But they take with them a unity and a will to win that's earned this country admiration from around the world. There are still many people who doubt that Ukraine can ultimately prevail against the might of Russia, but few, if any of them, come from this country. Ask pretty much any Ukrainian what they expect for 2023, and they only have one answer: victory. Rory Shannons, Al Jazeera, Kiev.
What a great reminder of how resilient the Ukrainian peoples are as they've had to carve out a life for themselves. It's been unbelievable what they've had to face. A year ago, many of you joined us. We had a call with Roger Sandberg, our Vice President of Global Programs. He was already in Ukraine very early on, within days, if not, or weeks, if not days, from the crisis breaking out. He did a call just like this so that you, our donors that are passionate about this, could hear from the front lines as we were trying to figure out what we were going to do to respond. And medical teams from that time when Roger was there, we've been on the ground since the early days of the war. And now we want to give you the opportunity to hear from some of our staff that have been so critical to planning and executing a response a year later. So we are I'm very excited to have Dr. Trina Helderman. She is the interim senior director of our Humanitarian Response Team at Medical Teams. She's also a board-certified emergency medical physician and has 14 years of humanitarian health experience responding to sudden onsets ranging from Haiti to Nepal to South Sudan and Iraq. So we are very grateful to have you here with us today, Dr. Trina. And joining us also is Sara Phillips. Sara serves as the Senior Response Manager here at Medical Teams. She's a family nurse practitioner with over 15 years of experience in domestic and international health management. Sara led the First In team and has traveled to Ukraine in several different capacities over this last year. We're honored to have them both on this call and to give us some insight on our response. So let me give a few ground rules again. For all of you, I appreciate how nimble you've all been that are listening. Instead of having a chat, which has been disabled, you've been typing your name in the Q&A function. That's awesome. So as this program is going, if you have questions for Sara and Dr. Trina, please use the Q&A function. It's right at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that and then write in your question. It'll either be answered by some of my colleagues here at Medical Teams, or we'll get to it at the very end of our time together. So let's go back to the beginning and peel back the curtain. 1 year ago, when the conflict in Ukraine started, what does that really look like for Medical Teams as we are preparing to assess and respond to a new crisis? And let's start with you, Sara.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. Medical Teams sort of has a three-pronged approach we look at when a new crisis happens in the world, whether that is an outbreak or a natural disaster or conflict. We look at what the needs are. We look at, do we have the capacity to meet those needs? Do we have the right people and resources? And can we access the place that the crisis is in? There are some places in the world that for various reasons we don't have access to. So when the war in Ukraine started, actually I was in Ethiopia with our CEO, Martha Newsom, on a field visit. And very vividly remember sitting at breakfast over Ethiopian coffee and just kind of soberly considering, what does this mean for us? As an organization, we have a team called the Humanitarian Response Team that I am on, that sort of does that initial evaluation of what are the needs, do we need to go, and are engaging with sort of coordination around the world on what kinds of opportunities there may be for international organizations like ours. At the very beginning, the estimates were that there would be 3.5 million Ukrainians would be displaced by the conflict. And we felt like that was a significant enough need for us to at least go in and assess to potentially stand up a response. Of course, we now know that that estimate was very low because more than 16 million people have been displaced by this conflict. In terms of access, Ukraine and the border countries where refugees were pouring into early on had all requested for help from international organizations, from everything from buses to take refugees further west in Europe, to medical care, to lodging and food, and kind of all that's needed to take care of millions and millions of vulnerable people. We actually initially, our First In team, I flew from Ethiopia to Poland and went straight to the mall to buy a coat because it was snowing and quite cold. We did quick blitz through Poland, just a couple of days, quickly realized that there were lots of international organizations already responding and that there was less need for us there. We went to Romania for about a day and a half. At this point, Dr. Trina had joined us, myself and Roger, and did some similar engaging coordination there and other partners. And then we went to Moldova. We went to Moldova because it's a border country with Ukraine. It's also the poorest country in Europe. And at the time, there were over 500,000 refugees that had come into a tiny country of less than 4 million people. And Medical Teams had a history of working in Moldova and had some pre-existing contacts. So that's where we initially started our response and from there, we started cross-border work into Ukraine. So yeah, it was looking at all of these things. What is the need? What are our opportunities and access? And do we have the resources? So it was at the very beginning, we started fundraising quite quickly. And I know many of you on the call were part of the giving that enabled us to make those very, very early decisions to respond and to get myself and others on the ground as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Sara. So over coffee in Ethiopia, started the brainstorming. Is there need? Is there access? And do we have the resources?
Yes.
So then we go a year later. Dr. Trina, what have we done there? What has been our response in the Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, what Sara had said, just in terms of the donations, we have fully been responding with the donations people have given to Ukraine so far. So we have both our response that we had in Moldova, which was a variety of things. So just like we said, we go based on what are the needs. So we had frontline border patrolmen who had many refugees flooding across the borders, seeing medical needs, not really knowing how do I, deal with people in certain ways. So we provided training for them, both first aid kits with a first aid training and then psychological first aid training as well, just to give them more tools within their own personal resources to be able to help with the refugees coming in. We supported some shelters, some small shelters that were housing and accommodating refugees, providing food. And then we also started supporting some clinics that were providing medical care for refugees. So that was all in Moldova. And eventually we also were able to set up some mental health and psychosocial programming ourselves, just providing counseling, some group therapy, and some other like community activities for the refugees there in Moldova. But we did want to get into Ukraine. The needs there are obviously much higher, as still many areas of Ukraine are unsafe. And so that kind of started more in the west, and then we kind of worked our way over east. And so we've had some mental health and psychosocial programming again, doing counseling, group therapy in a few different locations, actually 3 different locations within Ukraine. And then we have also identified other local partners. So there are so many helpers within this response, so many small community-based organizations, churches, local organizations that have all stepped up or created a new organization for this response, for the crisis, that we were able to support. So we have one local partner called the City Help and Interaction Center that we were able to support with some medications for a pharmacy that they had opened. And also they were providing food and like different toiletries and stuff, distributing those to the people displaced. And then we have another partner, 100% Life, that we've been working with. They, prior to the conflict, were doing medical work, mostly for HIV and TB, but they've shifted over to doing emergency mobile medical teams. And so we've been able to support them and the work that they're doing in areas that had been occupied, but have since come back under Ukrainian control. And so they're able to provide medical care there. And one of the big things that we were able to do is we were able to procure and distribute 110 generators. So these are small generators for primary healthcare clinics that we were able to distribute in areas of Dnipro and Kherson. You maybe have seen Kherson City in the news, but Kherson Oblast, a little bit further in the north, the Oblast is kind of like a state. So a little bit in the northern part of the state, a lot of facilities had been damaged, power has been out. And so we've been able to provide these generators to help provide power, to provide heat, and enable the health facilities to remain open in spite of the power cuts and the ongoing conflict. So really a huge part. I think we have over 1 million people who are served by the clinics that received our generators, which is, just feels like it was an enormous feat, but at the same time, we're really proud that we had the flexibility of our funding to be able to procure them and also to be able to get them distributed out before winter.
Wow, that's an awesome story, Dr. Trina. One of the things we do at medical teams is we strengthen health systems. And what a very practical example of like a health system can't run without power. And to those 110 generators, we're able to scale to create, to serve a population the size of 1 million. So that's a great story. So from early days, Moldova, then moving into Ukraine from the west, slowly getting east, working in areas that were formerly occupied. Let's go back to you, Sara. what were the early days like of, what was it like on the ground in those early days and months as our response was starting to unfold?
Sure. I mean, to a degree, it was quite chaotic. You can't have this degree of population displacement and sort of uncertainty about what would be happening with the war without a degree of chaos. And there were a lot of organizations like ourselves who wanted to respond, but then trying to get a handle on where the needs were, and required a lot of pivoting. As you know, you kind of get one story perspective and maybe drive out to a village where you'd heard there were some specific needs and find that it had already been met and we needed to move on. With the scale of the population displacement, what this meant in the very early days is that the borders exiting Ukraine to the west, north and west, had very long queues. Sometimes people waited 3 to 7 days at a border queue to get out. And so people were fleeing, they were fearful, they would get across the border and then not know, where am I going to get my next meal? Where am I going to stay? Where do I go from here? In the very, very early days, a lot of the people who left Ukraine were the ones who had resources, they had vehicles, and maybe were a little bit better off and had maybe family or friends that they were connecting with in a border country. But we saw that change very quickly as the days went on. And there was this sort of sobering reality that was sinking in that this war was going to be way bigger and far more destructive than people had initially anticipated. There was a thought very early on that the war would be very limited to the far eastern areas of Ukraine. But of course, we all know now that Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, was bombed within the first couple of days, and many Western cities were as well. And that was really what led to such significant need, is that it hasn't been geographically limited. There's continued to be ongoing destruction in many cities and areas of the country. So yeah, I think early on it was sort of that scramble to make sure that the resources were being sort of put where the needs were, and where the people were, and there was just so much movement. But as Dr. Trina mentioned, one of our realizations very early on was that Ukrainians and border countries had a lot of capacity to help and wanted to help, and were already helping. You know, we got there a few days into the conflict, and to see that people were already opening their homes, their pantries, their wallets. There were people who were literally working their day job and then spending every single night at a shelter making and serving food. And just the generosity and the caring for one another, the neighboring, was so humbling to see. And I know I had a personal connection to a group of sort of Christians and missionaries in Moldova, got added to their WhatsApp group, and it was the most amazing thing to watch the connections happening. Hey, I have a family of 7. I know they're crossing at this border at this time. Can anyone pick them up? I have an aunt. She can host 7 people. Can someone, bring people to her house? She's going to be around. And just to see those very human connections and caring for each other was just really phenomenal to sort of watch unfold in front of us. And then that really led us to say, how do we find these people and these organizations, entities, et cetera, that are helping, and how do we resource them so that they can scale up and continue doing this work?
That's unbelievable. Like loving your neighbor in the most radical and practical ways amidst just crazy conflict. Yeah, thank you for those stories. Dr. Trina, you have been in many responses in your career. How's this one unique or different? What stands out about this, what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. One, what Sara just mentioned, just the good neighboring. I think that's a great term. I haven't heard that one, Sara, so I might take it from you. But yeah, just really good neighboring, really good help. I've not ever I've been to many different emergencies and have never seen almost the entire population, who in some ways was also affected, right? Like the conflict is in Ukraine, like the country is at war, but here you would see like people hosting other Ukrainians within their homes, like Sara said, all of the volunteership. And it frankly made it sometimes a little bit hard to know where are the needs, because the needs were being provided for, but you also knew they weren't being paid. They didn't have fundraising arms, of some of these little charity groups. And so we knew that at some point they're going to be tired, or at some point they're going to need a break, or at some point somebody else is going to need to step in behind them, if nothing else, to just support them, emotionally, psychologically, because they've also been hearing stories and just, having to reflect on the distress of the conflict, but then also seeing the conflict maybe more up close, even if they weren't, further in the east where the conflict was happening. So I think that was one thing. But the other that I think most organizations found extremely challenging was the fact that, Ukraine is very much like Europe. When I was there, I was sitting on the sidewalk, having a cup of coffee, actually a latte, with my, fancy sandwich. And I think they had like these Parmesan frites or something. I mean, it is for all purposes, it's very much like Europe. Actually, it's also like Indiana. I'm not sure. I'm from Indiana. It was kind of like going through Indiana with field after field and little tiny towns, and then suddenly you're in a big city that looks like Europe. And that really is kind of how Ukraine is. And there's an established healthcare system. The people were getting passports still during the conflict. The postal service was working. Like the infrastructure is there. And I think one of the things that most of the organizations found quite challenging is that we're really used to going into a system where there is no system, or the system is so broken and like bare bones that it's quite easy to see how we can step in and improve health services or improve access to care. But here it was a lot more complicated, and really it's only in the places that are under conflict, so more at the front line, where healthcare services don't exist. But for the most part, they're there. And so it's trying to figure out, okay, what is the barrier here preventing people from being able to get the care? And one of the things in a survey we did recently was looking at, one of the big things is cost. So people still do have to pay for some medications. They have to pay for some of their healthcare, just like here in the States, and they don't have any money. A lot of people aren't working. They've had to flee. They're not able to stay in their jobs. And so trying to figure out, what are the new modalities, the new ways of working. We can't pick up one of our super well-running clinics in Uganda and stick it in Ukraine. It's just completely different context, a different scenario. And so I think that it has taken a little bit longer than for us to really identify the actual needs and to be able to say, okay, what can we input here to be able to help improve access to care?
I think you're painting the picture of like the complexity of how we need to respond. And that, just even that example earlier of the generators, like there is a public health system, it already exists, but when there's war, it might go completely offline. And you guys saw, like, how do you work in a way that gets that system that's already there back online so it could serve people and be operating. And the generator example is a great one of how those clinics couldn't serve the 1 million people unless they were back online. So I am curious. In a little bit, I do want to get into the weeds of like, what does a day look like? But first, I want to jump back and say, what does medical teams doing on the ground? How are they showing up on the ground right now? Like what's practically it look like for our teams and what they're doing? And I'll shoot that one to you, Sara.
Sure. So it looks like a sort of variety of things. We're doing some of what we call direct implementation, where it's our teams, our staff that we've hired who are doing the work. That's primarily in the mental health and psychosocial support space. We call that MHPSS. I realize that this sector has a lot of acronyms that are not known to others. So in MHPSS, we are sending our teams out to smaller villages. They might be going to shelters. They may be going to churches or community centers. They're hosting support groups. So it might be a group therapy. It might be a one-off topical thing on maybe grief or how to talk to your children about suffering and loss. Or it may be individual therapy, or they may be doing a series of sessions. We've done a couple of rounds of using some different curriculum models where we take participants through a 6 to 8 week series that covers a variety of topics that are really meant to build people's coping skills and resilience. And then we are also doing supporting partners to do work. So we may be delivering medicine to a couple of the free pharmacies that Dr. Trina mentioned. We're helping to staff those. So we may be monitoring and checking up on sort of the consumption and the needs at those sites. We are ensuring that our partners have the fuel, the generators, the meds, the medical supplies, kind of all of these things that they need to do, like mobile medical teams or the food to feed people, the food kits that they're giving out. So it's, for us in this particular response, it's a mix of both directly doing the work, but then also kind of providing support and a degree of supervision to our partners who are also doing part of the work themselves. And then there's a lot of meetings. I'll just be really honest. Sometimes this work is, it sounds very exciting on paper, but then oftentimes there's just a lot of meetings. There's coordination meetings. We're meeting with other partners, with government officials, with things like the World Health Organization and UNICEF and UNHCR, all these big entities that you hear about. We're in daily coordination meetings with many of them because there has to be a degree of a sort of coordinated effort. And so when one partner says they're doing mobile medical teams, it needs to mean something fairly consistent when another partner says they're doing mobile medical teams. So we do spend a lot of time in those kind of settings doing coordination to ensure that sort of the standard and the quality of what's being delivered to vulnerable people is fairly consistent just across sort of the humanitarian response.
Thank you. So it sounds like medical team's overall response is in coordination, looking for specific ways they could plug in and solve problems, like the generator example being one. A lot of psychosocial support to people that are experiencing PTSD and other trauma related to the war and conflict. And then a lot of just basic coordination with the partners to see where are the gaps and jumping in, whether that's getting a delivery of medicines, filling in with staffing clinics or pharmacies with staff that are just to make sure these health systems continue to be up and running. Am I kind of getting a good sense of, are there any key things about our response that I'm missing?
No, I think those are kind of touch the major things. We do anticipate or hope to sort of contingent on resources, be able to start implementing some mobile medical teams on our own. So we are looking to expand our direct implementation in a different area than our local partners are doing mobile medical teams. And it is always, there's the thing with humanitarian response in an emergency context is the situation is quite fluid. The front lines are changing, accessibility is changing. And so we have to maintain a degree of agility to kind of alter what our programming looks like in order to be in a position that we're continuing to meet real needs.
Well, I'm going to pivot to, there's that pandemic word pivot. Sorry, I apologize. To a question, there's a lot of questions in the Q&A around our kind of response around counseling and psychosocial support. So Dr. Trina, can you share a little bit more about what are we doing around psychosocial support? And particularly, you could maybe address this. One of our attendees, Glenn, asked like, what's happening with children with PTSD issues? And so if you want to get into kind of our work around that.
Yeah.
And then one other thing,
Sure.
this is not to you two, but to those online or that are hosting this, it was requested that there be a map showing where we're working. If that is not going to compromise any security risks, if y'all could find a map and share it. If we don't show a map to all you that are watching today, it's just because of security issues.
Yeah, we have one that's a bit general, so that will
Okay, great.
We can share it. Sarah's going to find it. So when we look at mental health and psychosocial support, it's actually within these emergency contexts, kind of a pyramid. So there's different layers and more people. So if you look at like people who need serious support, so like the question of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, people who have severe debilitating anxiety or depression, the number of people within a conflict that require that level of care is usually actually pretty small, like probably maybe around 5 to 8%, if you will, if people need that very high level of care. But the vast majority of people just need to have a little bit of restoration of normality. And so that's the bottom of this pyramid. So the largest part, and that is like your basic needs. So having shelter, having food, having water, feeling safe. And so a lot of those things, it's also having information. So knowing where they can go to get some of the basic needs and things that they have. And so a lot of the humanitarian efforts of, providing cash, providing shelter, the money that we're giving to City Help and Interaction Center so that they can do food distributions, all of those things are in many ways helping to contribute to mental health needs because people feel more safe, they feel more stable. Above those basic needs are more social connection. And so if you think about like, if you needed to, flee from your house, maybe to another city right away, you don't have a lot of your support network. You don't have your church. You don't have your neighbors. You don't know where to go, like to the pharmacy or to the grocery store. Like it's a completely new environment. And so you feel a little bit like off, like I don't know what to do. And that creates a lot of stress. And so helping people get reconnected, helping the displaced people from different areas who maybe know each other, helping to connect them to family, helping kids get back into school, because school gives them like structure and that's something that they know. All of those things also help to contribute. And then there's this middle layer of people who need some kind of basic counseling, therapy, more awareness, but it's not necessarily like we need to send them to psychiatrist or that they need really advanced care, but just some basic counseling to help them understand, some of the resources that they have, both internally and within the local context. And so we have had a mental health and psychosocial support coordinator. She actually had worked with us in our Turkey response several years ago. So not in this recent earthquake, but when we were responding in Turkey, Gaziantep, during part of the Syria crisis. And so she was working with our local mental health and psychosocial support team. So they were counselors who had already been trained in Ukraine as therapists and counselors. We provided some additional training with them and some structure and framework that they could utilize for awareness sessions in different communities to help them understand, like, what are some of the normal reactions to living through a crisis or distressing events or, traumatic events, if you will, like what would be a normal or even an abnormal response to that so that people would recognize that, do they need some basic help or actually is this person being identified with someone who needs more advanced care that we can refer them to, because we are not providing that super high level of like psychiatric care or inpatient services. But we do have other organizations who are providing that, or local hospitals and such that we can refer people to. We did actually support one psychiatric hospital that had been in the east in Donetsk, where I think it was Donetsk. Is that right, Sara? Or Luhansk? Luhansk. So in a conflict area, and they had basically put everyone on a bus and evacuated them out. And so moved them into another almost like kind of vacant building that they were going to reset up as a new psychiatric hospital, but they didn't have, you know, some of the basic things that they needed, you know, beds and, you know, linens and that kind of stuff, but then also some of the medications. So we were able to support with that. And so that's kind of how we look at it. So we're doing individual counseling, like I said, group therapy. So it may be with just like women or men, adolescents or children. And then frankly, a ton of awareness raising, because mental health had a pretty big stigma in Ukraine. And so particularly men don't feel like it's something that they need to get involved with. And so right now we're seeing it's a lot of women coming, but trying to figure out how can we reach out to men, because we do know that they've also been affected. And then also the carers. So we talked about all of these helpers, all of the neighbors, all of the volunteers who are providing support and services. And they're exhausted, like they're exhausted, they're feeling, you know, burnout, as they even say. And so helping them to think about, you know, how do they process through these things? What are some tools we can give them so that they can stay resilient and continue to serve? Even within our own team, that's something that we're looking at all the time. You know, how do we prepare our staff going in beforehand, but then also be able to provide the support that people need when they are experiencing some of these pretty distressing events and hearing a lot of stories.
That really, thank you for sharing that. We believe at medical teams that people are resilient, and a lot of what you're describing is just providing enough support to help people unlock the resiliency and finding the support that they need. And war has such an impact on us as humans. It creates so much trauma. And that level of care is so critical for those that are facing it head on and daily. Very shortly, I do want to ask each of you to share a story from your experience. But before we jump into that, I'd love to, one question that we've gotten a couple times in here is kind of what is making medical teams unique or different? There's a lot of other orgs. There's bigger, larger, smaller, all sorts of other orgs, but what's medical teams doing that's unique or differentiates us in this response in Ukraine?
I think, I mean, we're certainly not the only organization working alongside and through local partners, but I do think that's a little bit more sort of close to our heart and ethos. And I think because we are a faith-based organization, our ability and sort of comfort level of working alongside local churches as well. We did that very early on in Moldova because it was a lot of the local churches who were responding and providing space for shelters. And one of our free pharmacies has been set up in a church, just that space is something that we can navigate, and we can come alongside those faith-based partners and work with them. Of course, the challenge is always maintaining humanitarian principles of neutrality, and that is always difficult in a conflict, especially one like this where everyone in the country is involved in the conflict to a degree. And so we do have to be quite careful to maintain sort of our independence as a humanitarian organization, and that can be challenging, but we've had lots of opportunities to come alongside faith-based partners, which we're really grateful for.
Maybe, Mike, if I can just add one other thing, and I don't think, again, this is probably totally unique to medical teams, but one thing I have been very thankful for is that though, you know, we would like to get some larger grants from, you know, like the government donors and such. The fact that we were using private funding for the majority of our response gave us a ton of flexibility. You know, a lot of these big institutional, as we call them, the government grants, they come with a lot of specific stipulations, where you can use it, how you can use it, which local partners you're able to give money to. So some of these very tiny little groups that just started up for the response themselves probably wouldn't be able to get funding from some of those government grants. But we've been able to say, you're doing an amazing job. Let us give you just a little bit of funding to be able to help you and to support you. And I've been really thankful that we have had such a huge outpouring of support from that side, that it has given us a ton of flexibility, and we've been able to say, like, okay, what strategy really does make sense here? You know, what is that input that we can make so that we could say, you know, it is the generators or it's funding this organization, and that we haven't had to just stick to some of the more standard structures and frameworks that just didn't really fit. And I think if you read articles, or there have been quite a few articles that have come out talking about how all the money that's being donated in is not actually getting out to be able to serve in Ukraine. And a lot of that is this big government money that has come in, and a lot of it's because it is tied up in different ways. And so I think we've been fortunate to be able to really focus in our strategy and be able to do some one-offs. Even we did some trauma kit distributions for a while because we could, and we had a local partner that was getting out into the community, and they were able to do that. So I think that that has been just a huge win for us, and enabled us to really meet some very specific needs that, frankly, if we had had a big, you know, US government grant that we were working off of, we probably wouldn't have been able to do.
That's really helpful to hear. So because donors like all of you that are listening in gave unrestricted private donations to medical teams so that we could do a response, it's given you the flexibility and nimbleness to respond and pivot. There's that word again, to respond to where you see the need is greatest, and also to work through partners that are on the ground that really are really making an impact. And they couldn't have access to this big institutional funding, but medical teams could quickly and nimbly get out there and make a big impact because of the flexibility of how the funding came in. There's some other, there's a lot of good questions online. Catherine, we will get to your true question. She first started with, what if I gave $1,000? What would that do in Ukraine? And then she upped it to, well, how about, what if I gave $10,000? What would that do in Ukraine? We can answer that. And Mike Goodwin, our former board chair, asked a question about what institutional funding opportunities are possibly coming down the pipeline. But I'd love to hear, at least, we probably have time for one of you to share a story from this last year. So I'll let you two decide which story would you like to share from your work this last year?
Did one come to you, Sarah, or do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
Just before this, we were talking about which story comes to mind. I mean, I think for me, I was in the first in team with Sara in Moldova, and then went back to Ukraine, and I was there in September and October. And during that time, it was right before the kind of Southern offensive, when some of the areas that had been occupied had kind of been taken back by the Ukrainian forces. And so we quite serendipitously, if you will, had just before this happened, identified this partner, 100% life. And so when things opened up, they're like, hey, we're going to go. Do you guys want to support us? And so they went, and we were able to support them very quickly in doing some mobile medical teams really early when it opened up. And after they came back, you know, they were kind of telling us some of the stories. And, you know, one of the things that was super hard to think about was a lot of a lot of them were like remote small villages. And it was mostly a lot of elderly people who stuck around. You know, a lot of the young people had more resources, ability to leave. And so you have some of these villages. There was one village with just like two 90-year-old guys that were still left there. And, you know, the team from 100% Life is thinking, like, I don't even know who would help them to like repair their homes and different things. And one of the villages that they went to, they were giving out some medication and providing medical care. And Misha, so one of the doctors, he was asked to kind of go and visit this guy in his home. And so he went and visited him and was talking to him. And he had kind of been just like, not totally bedridden, but really just couldn't leave his home. And so neighbors were bringing him food and other things, but he was pretty sick. And Misha's like, okay, you know, we'll get the ambulance to come, and then we'll be able to take you to the hospital. And the guy's like, you know what, I'm old and I've already seen all of the things that have happened here. And he's like, it's not worth it. He's like, I should just stay here in my home and die. Like, you know, it's like everything has already been lost. And I think it's just hard to think about that, like the, you know, the finality of it, but then just feeling like, you know, hope is kind of gone. So that was one story that really stuck with me.
We appreciate that. And I'd love for us to, you two have done a great job of stirring up lots of questions. So we're going to answer some of the questions that have come in online. So Mike Goodwin, I'd mentioned this, had asked about, have we been able to find some institutional funding partners to complement? And can you share a little bit about that? And then we'll get to that one person's question. I'm not seeing it anymore, but I think it was Leanne. She asked about what could $1,000 do in a project and what could $10,000 do?
Yeah, I actually answered the 1,000 question. So I suppose you could multiply it by 10. It sort of depends on a lot of things, but $1,000 would help us buy somewhere between 15 and 20 first aid kits. It'd probably provide chronic disease medication for a month for about 100 people, and half of a generator. So we do try to be as resourceful with the funds that we have as possible. In terms of institutional funding, we have one large institutional funding grant that we have submitted to ECHO, which is sort of the European Union funding mechanism for humanitarian response. That's a consortium. It's not just us. We went in with another international organization because we can't actually apply for EU funding without having an EU office ourselves. And then we are a vetted partner with the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund, which is a sort of a pool fund that is very common in these types of crises. And we are expecting that they'll put out a call for proposals in the next couple of weeks, which we will be applying for. And we remain, in very close contact with other potential donors or other partners that have significant amounts of funding. We've not yet been able to secure institutional funding, and part of that is just sort of timing. And in this particular crisis, donors have been very interested in supporting the very large organizations where they can give a huge award to, because it's less administration on the donor themselves to oversee. So it's put us in a challenging position, and we do certainly need to secure institutional funding quickly. But that is kind of a point of prayer that we will have success for the proposals that we've submitted and the ones that we anticipate putting forward in the coming weeks.
Dr. Trina, thank you for that, Sara. Someone online asked a question. What do you think men and women and children in Ukraine would want to tell us? What would they want us to know as we're sitting here today? What if they were here face to face, what would they share about their reality, about what how they hope we engage?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll try to respond with this with basically just with the discussions that I've had with, our staff and different people I've met. I think they were surprised. Like, they really didn't think that this conflict was going to happen, even though there were rumors. So it was all quite a shock for sure to the system. And they are thankful. They're thankful for the help of their neighbors. They're thankful for the help that's coming from all over the world. But also they're tired, they're tired of this conflict. I think everyone is tired of the conflict and really hoping for peace and to be able to, return to their homes, return to the lives that they were building and, try to pick the pieces back up. So I think just continued prayers for peace, that this conflict would come to an end quickly, and that people would be able to go home. I think a lot of people just really want to go home.
Yes, home is so crucial, and 13 million people have had their home stripped from them, and there's no it's unclear when that's going to settle down enough. But thank you to your teams that are on the front lines, that are providing nimble, quick care. You guys are like the MacGyvers of response. You're just jumping in wherever there's need and being flexible, providing critical psychological, psychosocial support, providing real practical needs, backfilling clinics, getting key medicines, solving problems like the generators. It's just fantastic. And I'm going to answer a couple questions as we come to an end. There was one question about who we serve, and we are a faith-based organization. So what does that mean about the large numbers of people of other faiths in the Ukraine? We're really a faith-inspired organization, and that means our faith inspires us to love all people, regardless of who they are, their background, whatever. So of course, Medical Teams is loving everyone in the Ukraine. And we love everyone in every one of the projects area, period, because everyone matters to us and to God. And so we're faith inspired, and our faith keeps us going because this can be hard work. Another one of our leaders of our Healthy Women, Healthy World program, which if you've never heard of that, go to our website. You can find out information. It's pretty awesome. Deb Perry asked, how do we decide to respond or apply resources there's the earthquake happening right now in Turkey, and there's been what's happened when Sara was having coffee in northern Ethiopia. How do we decide to do Ukraine? It goes back to kind of Sara's first answer. Is there need? Is there access? And are there resources? And we need all three of those things. And we are in Ukraine because there was clearly need, there was access, we were able to get on the ground quick, and the resources has been because of you. We only have private resources for Ukraine, and we raised millions of dollars, and it's allowing us to stay there for the long haul. We are going to be there for a long while. We are also looking for an institutional partner, as Sara and Dr. Trina shared. That's the perfect balance when you have donors like you that believe in Medical Teams and give us the private resources so we could get there quick. And then we have an institutional partner come in and cover the costs over the long haul. So we really will stay and work in places if we have that beautiful combination of you who are here, you are part of the team that give us the resources to get there, and then an institutional partner that funds us for the long haul. That's how it works. So you could be praying for more institutional partners to come through with us in Ukraine. And if you want to support what's happening with our work in Ukraine, it's one of our core things that we are doing now. So you could just continue supporting Medical Teams. That provides all the support that comes to us, helps us be able to continue our programming everywhere we're at, including Ukraine. So please continue to give a gift to us. We also saw Deb Hirsch asked, did we have volunteers go? Yes, very early in the response, we had people that were trained, and response goes volunteers to work on the front lines, because that's one of our core pieces here at Medical Teams too, is we scale through you, our partners that give to us financially, but our partners that volunteer their time and their effort and the resources to go to the field. So I just want to thank you, both of you, Sara and Dr. Trina, for leading your teams to do unbelievable, great work. There's a lot of people on this call here today, and there's a lot more people that couldn't be here that will see this webinar. Tell your teams, we love you guys. We're with you. We want to support you and get you all that you need to do great work. Just thank you. And to all of you that are here, thank you for supporting Medical Teams. I said it earlier, but it's how we operate. It's in our name, Medical Teams. Everyone is part of the story to make it possible for Dr. Trina and Sara to be there, for their teams to be there. They can't be there without you. We need you. We need you a year ago when you were there to help us get off the ground, and we need you going forward. So thank you for your prayers, your support, your partnership, your engagement. Share this widely with your friends and tell them you know of an organization that gets to disasters quickly and responds fully with all of our hearts. So thank you for being with us today. Thank you for joining this call. And if you did not get your question answered, I will hang out for a little bit longer, and we also have the questions seen on, and we will reply to you directly in email if we have your email address. So thank you, everyone. You all can go back to your lunches or whatever it is. I'll stay on and answer any final questions, but we really appreciate all of you. And we also appreciate you, Sara and Dr. Trina. Thank you for being with us today.